lecture in this year's History of American Architecture lecture series. My name again is Greg Whitcup, and I have the pleasure to serve as the director of Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. I would like to once again begin by thanking our sponsor, our friends at the Smith Group. Thank you for continuing to support the center and the work we do to steward and share Cranbrook's remarkable 118-year history, including the legacy of our architecture and the architects that designed it. Again, for those of you that missed any of the previous lectures in this series, don't worry, we are recording them. If you missed one or would like to rewatch one of them, simply send us an email at center@cranbrook.edu, and Emma Brick will be glad to send you a link. Last week, I called your attention to our upcoming gala fundraiser, a house party at Cranbrook celebrating Loya Saarinen and the party's guests of honor, Eero's son and daughter, Eric Saarinen and Susan Saarinen, as well as his nephew, Robert Swanson. The in-person gala at Kingswood School and the online film premiere both take place on Saturday, May 21st. This week, I would like to call your attention to another upcoming program, this one in our Uncovering the Archives series. While the mission of the center is many-pronged, at the heart of our work is Cranbrook Archives, encompassing nearly 2.5 million documents and records, photographs and negatives. The archives is where the stories are preserved and through which they are brought to life through the work of scholars from around the world, including Kevin Atkinson. On Monday evening, March 21st, we invite you to join us for the virtual program, Pipson, Saarinen, Swanson, Making of a Modern Designer. This largely untold story of Eero's sister Pipson and the work she did to bring modern design into the homes of middle-class America will be told by Pipson's granddaughter, Karen Swanson, and Alison Kowalski, a Canadian design historian. I should also note that Karen Swanson also will be joining us for this year's house party as one of the guests of honor. It will be an evening you won't want to miss. To find out more about this virtual lecture, the house party, and all of the center's programs, events, and tours, please visit our website, center.edu, center.cranbrook.edu. And now, without further ado, it is once again my pleasure to turn the center's virtual podium over to the center's curator, Kevin Atkinson, our guide extraordinaire to the story of Eero Saarinen and his circle. Take it away one more time, Kevin.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks everyone for being here this evening. We are now in week 4, kind of unbelievable, but we have traversed our way through 3 distinctly different buildings associated with Eero Saarinen and his circle. Last week, of course, we focused on the Miller House, and the Miller House was really this sort of jewel of a project. It was a collaborative effort between Eero Saarinen, Dan Kiley, Alexander Gerard, and the Miller family. Tonight, we look at the TWA terminal, which by scale probably has more to do with General Motors Technical Center, where we're dealing with huge teams of people. And it also has a significantly broader impact. Remember that the Millers were extraordinarily private about how their house could be published and presented. The TWA terminal brings us to a very different idea of architecture as a commodity and architecture as a way of building a brand and a business. Now, tonight, our circle is rooted in sort of 2 main areas. The architectural office of Eero Saarinen and Associates, which is still at this point in the late 1950s, being led by 2 principals here alongside Eero Saarinen. The Irish-American architect Kevin Roach, who is the sort of right-hand man on design, and John Dinkeloo, who is both the office manager, and in the case of the TWA terminal, he's also coordinating between the engineers, the contractors, and the client. So he's really a sort of integral figure in building what is possibly the most complicated construction Eero Saarinen and Associates ever pull off. As the architectural firm grew in the 1950s, they continued to hire new employees, like a young architect, Edward Saad, who was born in the British Mandate in Palestine, immigrated to work in London, and then in the United States. He worked for Eero Saarinen for about 10 years before setting out on his own in Connecticut. And he was one of the key architects who was working on the TWA project. There's also César Pelli, and Pelli was born in Argentina, where he studied architecture before coming to the University of Illinois. He then came to work for Eero Saarinen about 10 years, and he was the design lead alongside Kevin Roach for the TWA terminal. Now, César Pelli would go on to build buildings under Victor Gruen as a design architect in Los Angeles, before in 1977 being appointed Dean of the Yale School of Architecture and setting up his own practice in New Haven. Now, next week, we're going to talk about how the many different people who worked under Eero Saarinen would continue to transform architecture later in the 20th century. But tonight, let's focus on what really makes TWA most unique about all of the Eero Saarinen projects we've discussed so far, and that's its engineering. The engineering of the project was led by Ammann and Whitney, an architectural structural engineering firm established in 1946 by Swiss immigrant Othmar Ammann and Charles S. Whitney. They were associated with Eero Saarinen and Associates on three extraordinarily complex concrete shell projects: Kresge Auditorium at MIT, the TWA terminal at JFK Airport, and Dulles International Airport in DC. Ammann and Whitney themselves were not terribly involved in working for Eero Saarinen. They were bridge designers, and they were busy building the Verrazano Narrows and rebuilding the George Washington Bridge. Instead, there are two associates of Ammann and Whitney who were working closely with Eero Saarinen and Associates. Boyd Anderson, who becomes Eero's most trusted structural engineer. He was leading a team of between 6 and 7 people working for Ammann and Whitney on TWA. That was about 3 or 4 engineers and 2 or 3 draftsmen. And then there was Abba Tor. And Tor would actually move from New York to Bloomfield Hills to work in the office of Eero Saarinen as a full-time representative of the structural engineers. He was born in Warsaw, and he immigrated to Israel and then to the United States in the 1950s. He returned to Israel, where he practiced as a structural engineer before coming back to the US in 1967. And it's through a series of oral history interviews conducted with Abba Tor that I'm able to get a lot more insight into the complicated nature and the working relationship between Eero Saarinen and Associates, the architects, and Ammann and Whitney, the engineers. What makes TWA so remarkable, and how I want to really focus on the project tonight, is unlike General Motors, Kleinhans Music Hall, or the Miller House, which are really design projects that have structural aspects, TWA becomes a mission of, can we build it? Can this actual shape, this concrete structure, exist? As we have the past few weeks, I'd like to start with an overview of the project and walk us through what it would be like to take a flight out of the TWA Flight Center around 1962. Then we'll review airport architecture as it was when Eero Saarinen received the commission. We'll learn a little bit more about TWA and their ambitions as a company, how the actual terminal was constructed, and then the sort of broader legacy of how this airline center really becomes emblematic of the entire US jet age. The approach to TWA is on axis with the Van Wyck Expressway, one of Robert Moses' transformational projects in the city of New York to bring cars out into the outer boroughs of Queens. JFK, or Idlewild Airport, was built on marshland and a former golf course that had had the name Idlewild, and it was designed to be a series of independent air terminals, each representing one airline. The TWA terminal is dead center on the expressway, and Saarinen designed a symmetrical building that would be seen across the gardens from the highway. The mid-1950s brought a new era in aviation, where corporate image was more important than ever, and where the middle class was beginning to use air travel as a major transportation form. In the mid-1950s, there was a flying boom, and in 1956, more Americans crossed the Atlantic by plane than by ship. Between 1945 and 1972, US passengers climbed from just 7 million to 32 million. And by 1960, about 50% of Americans had been in an airplane. It was a transformational change in how Americans moved. And so Idlewild Airport and the TWA terminal were meant to be the sort of structure for this change. We approach it by car, not by mass transit. And as you approach it, you have this one symmetrical view from the highway, and then you take the loop road around. And as you approach the building, this bird-like shape in the landscape seems to reach out to you. You come around past all the other terribly boring glass box terminals, and you arrive at this beautiful red sign, TWA, and this arched concrete entrance. The building is divided on the right-hand side for arrivals, or for departures, and on the left-hand side for arrivals. You continue to pull your car around until you're under this great cantilevered overhang. It reads almost like a bird's beak. And on the far right, you see the downspout that's shedding all of the water from the roof into a little pond right at the front of the building. Now, as you get out of your car, you are sort of passing 1950s tail fins into an architecture that is equally swooping and curvaceous. The concrete formwork is left exposed, and you get a sense of not only how the building is put together, but also just the sheer weight of this great concrete bird. There's a New Yorker cartoon where two pigeons are sitting looking at a sketch of the terminal and says, "Poor bird, can't too heavy for liftoff." And so you understand the sort of compressive force of the building as you move towards the front door. Now, in most of the PR material, TWA advertised that it was just one door from car to plane. And when you cross this glass threshold, you go from the sort of swooping, curvaceous exterior language into a equally swooping and curvaceous interior language. Now, the building is predominantly a concrete structure, but inside the building, there is a mixture of concrete, sheetrock, and plaster, as well as wooden construction. And yet, as a visitor, you'll never really know the difference because the interior of the building has been entirely sheathed in millions of tiny Japanese marble tiles that are about the size of a dime, and they create a sort of uniform surface. They create this total effect where the building has a sort of uniformity by virtue of these dime-shaped marble tiles that cover the walls, the floor, the furniture. You enter and you see the desk on the left, the check-in desk on your right, and you realize that the architecture and the infrastructure are sort of one shared structural language, where the main information desk, seen here in a stunning photograph by Ezra Stoller, is sort of supporting this great clicking sign. Now, very quickly after 1962, many of the sort of old train station style clipboards are replaced with televisions, and the building begins to be transformed again and again. So I'm only going to show us photos from about 1962, when the TWA Flight Center was at its most pure as a sort of total work of art. From this entrance desk, you turn and you see the rest of the terminal, and you almost immediately are invited to see out to the airplanes. And so from this thin building, only 250 feet wide, we rise up a gentle set of steps and we look out at the airplanes beyond. Now, as you look out, you are also looking around at all of these swooping bridges and stairways. It has a sort of Piranesi-like fantasy. And notice the way that walls seem to swoop up and come to crisp edges, or they swoop around and wrap into a sort of unknown area. The building is really inviting us to engage in this sort of motion. It is implying the adventure of flight in a way that is I think, much more romantic and much more nonlinear than the actual rather technical aspects of taking a airplane through the sky. You go up the steps and you're immediately invited to step back down into a conversation pit in the manner of the Miller House, where we have all of Saarinen's beautiful red cushions and custom ashtrays, allowing us to sit and relax and look at the sort of drama of the tarmac. You can sit in this conversation pit, or you can sit in built-in furniture, where marble and marble tiles combine to create round seating areas, looking at what the Saarinen office called air fountains, these sculptural forms that house all of the air handling, the AC and heat, as well as the lighting system for the building. If we turn around from the conversation pit and look back, you get a better sense of the roof structure, and you see the bridge sort of cutting across the main building. The roof is joined together with 4 skylights that are delineating the 4 concrete sections that form the main structure of the flight center. At the center, that ever important aspect of travel, a clock and a speaker system. Now, once you've seen those bridges, you really have to go and climb them. And as you move through the terminal, Saarinen is very, very considered into how you get view sheds. He is working on the process of not just letting you sort of walk up a stair and see what you think you'll see, but turning you and shifting views so that you always are experiencing a new sort of appreciation of the terminal's design. The building, because of its sort of monolithic surface of tiles and the swooping curves, invites a very playful interaction. And in this photograph by Charles Eames, taken in May of 1962 when the building was dedicated, you see a child who doesn't distinguish between the sort of tiles of the floor and the tiles of the wall. And there is this sort of totalizing effect where the structure and the interior are one cohesive unit, and therefore you have to experience the entire unit. You don't actually want to stop from sort of running up the wall because the architecture is inviting you to climb up and explore. There's a wonderful aspect of play that sort of feeds into this sense of departure and excitement and travel. One of the most iconic photos of architecture in the 20th century, shot by Ezra Stoller, shows the flight center in all of its swooping and travel glory. You can get a sense from just this one image how you sort of climb the stairs, move the bridges, and then head out into the airplane. When the building opened, it was a media sensation, but not every architectural critic appreciated this sort of populist, exciting, haptic architecture. And one of Saarinen's toughest American critics was the Yale architecture historian Vincent Scully. To him, it was why was it a bird? Why was it so tortured? Why was it so complicated? Flying had a certain efficiency that this building didn't have. But Scully would later reevaluate his opinion. In a lecture about the TWA Flight Center in the early 2000s, Vincent Scully said that the genius of what Saarinen is doing here is he's making, quote, those about to fly move calmly and intelligently from the tin can of our automobiles to those other tin cans out in the field. In order to be shut up in and flung out into empty space, what an irrational series of actions. Anything could happen at any time. And Scully says that, the bravest people of the Middle Ages would never dare step onto a little airplane and go across the tarmac. And what Saarinen is doing here is, in fact, steadying us for the journey. In Scully's words, everything about TWA Terminal says, you can do it. It's going to be wonderful up there. And I think there is this sort of optimism of not just the immediate journey, but the entirety of the sort of American century. The building has an enormous sense of positivity and of grace and of sort of beauty with this idea of the modern jet age. Now, from the second floor of the building, you can look back down onto the check-in desk, or you can step into the Ambassador Club, which was the only interior that Eero Saarinen and Associates designed for the building. Coordinated by Warren Platner and working with Knoll Associates, we see a Noguchi-like fountain at the center with custom Eero Saarinen seats around the edge. Elsewhere, Raymond Loewy designs a series of bars and restaurants like the Lisbon Lounge or the London Pub seen here. They are named after places that TWA could fly you, and they have a certain international flair. Now, below these lounges are some of the very first baggage carousels to ever be implemented in a US airport. And you can see the carousels lead directly out mere feet to the waiting taxi cab. On the opposite side of the luggage carousels are the check-in desks, which feature early computerized booking and communication systems. So the building was not only structurally daring, but also technologically up to date. It's not all about these sort of major spaces, though. There are instances where the monolithic concrete structure invites you to sit and pause and to sort of feel both the light and the weight of the building all around you. As we stand at the bridge looking over the conversation pit and seeing the planes in the distance, there is a real theatricality, that's present in all of Eero Saarinen's work, but that really here sets the stage for a sort of living performance where you are both the actor and the audience, and where you can see all sorts of activity at all different scales in the distance and in the foreground. And the lighting is enhancing this sense of drama. Engineered and designed by Stanley McCandless, who is the lighting designer who taught Eero at Yale, who is a famous Broadway lighting designer, and who had worked in the Kleinhans Music Hall. Here brings modern lighting theory of balancing task lighting, washes with sparkle into a building that is an entirely concrete structure. You'll notice there's no conduit in the roof. All of the lighting was cast in place in the building, and it features a mixture of lights shooting up from the sort of sculptural piers and then shining down from individual spotlights. All of it quite dim, quite romantic, and always leading our eye to the brighter lights of the tarmac. It is so effective that TWA becomes the first airline to put lights on its tail fins, so that as the planes are taxiing in and out of the gateways from the terminal, you see the TWA floating, sort of inspiring confidence out in the airfield. Now, once we are actually ready to fly, we're going to take this concrete tube, this windowless sort of chute out to the plane. TWA's own PR department says, "This is the tunnel Alice followed to Wonderland. The flight center walkway leads to the excitement of air travel and distant lands." You end up in what was called a satellite, which was also designed by Saarinen, featuring those same built-in furniture and tiles. And then you head out across the new jetway towards your jet engine, where you're given a last glimpse back to the flight center. The entire process really is this incredibly theatric, incredibly dramatic allegory of flight. Inside the plane, it's hard to differentiate TWA from any other airline, and it's really hard to differentiate one sort of bus-like row of seats from any other bus row of seats. So what Saarinen has given us is this entire journey from the car to the plane that is probably going to be substantially more exciting than the actual air flight. Now, one New York City cab driver told a critic who was going to the building, "That's not just a building, Mac. It's a feeling. You get inside and you feel like you're floating." And there was this sort of universal appeal. You didn't have to fly TWA to see the terminal, and about 50% of the visitors in the early days were just there to see the building. It was a sensation and it was an experience. Now that we've seen the building, I want to focus a little bit more about what Eero Saarinen's office was like when they were actually producing this building, because they would transform the way that modern architectural offices were working on design. As I've mentioned in other lectures, it was a brutal place to work, working some 100 hours a week. Most people lived on their overtime. And in 1957, Eero hired a full-time cartoonist for the office, MIT-educated Swiss designer Claude de Forest, who came and he documented such tortured activities as every architect sitting in their little office thinking about their IBM project. For as much as everyone was sort of overworked and over intellectualizing all the buildings, it was also a transformational time in how they were thinking about buildings. They transitioned from using drawings and sketches to working with models. Now, models had been used by Eero Saarinen and Loija Saarinen when representing the Cranbrook projects. Here is a model made by Loija and her son Eero of Eliel's designs. But these models are really simply showing buildings that had already been sketched. What changes with TWA is that the building is never sketched, and instead the architect and the junior associates are working entirely in a model. Everyone worked with models, and young architects were jokingly called the fledglings, who were referred to as cardboard cutters. Models were in paper, they were in chipboard, and they were really working devices. They were not meant to show the finished product or to show the client what the building would look like. They were used to help design, like Eero here working on Morsk and Stiles colleges, or here where he's cutting up the model of Dulles Airport and he's figuring out the design in a three-dimensional form. The models become increasingly large, and they had a system of cardboard and mirrored telescopes and rolling wheelie chairs where they would roll through the projects and peek in with a periscope to try and understand the architectural space. As designs were refined and iterated, they would be documented by photographers like Richard Knight and Balthazar Korab. And these photographs could be used to then showcase the building to the client. As the projects got bigger, the office moved locations, first above a gas station on Woodward, and then to a former Jaguar dealership on Woodward. And these model photographs were really quite effective at showing the design of the building. While the mostly male culture of the Saarinen office was working on these models, we also have the continued influence of Aline Saarinen. And I'll talk more next week about how Aline really served as a foil to her husband and transformed Eero's sort of professional practice. She quit the New York Times in 1955 to become head of communications at Eero Saarinen Architects. She hired Pat Burley as an assistant to organize the photo collection and to manage press inquiries. And Aline begins to arrange engagements, lectures, publications, and client meetings, as well as social events for her architect husband. She really helps to transform Eero Saarinen into one of our first architect as celebrity, or what would come to be known as a starchitect. And I think a tribute or a testament to the sort of success that she has is when Jacqueline Kennedy invites the Saarinens to the inauguration in 1961. Now, the office wasn't all work. They did have enormous parties where they would have favorite party games of listing your 10 favorite architects and then defending why those are the best. They also threw parties for the old architectural models, whether they were burning them in a bonfire or one of my favorite parties that I wish I had a photo of, where the TWA models were used as chip holders and then silver awards from the project were used as the dips. They didn't think to save the models because they were working devices, and so none of these models survive. Now, the jet age is often sort of associated with the TWA terminal. And there is actually an exact moment in time, June 21st, 1958, when America enters the jet age, when the Boeing 707 goes into commercial flight. And who was on that inaugural journey but Eero Saarinen himself? And so he really is an architect who comes of age in the jet age, and he becomes the architect who creates the jet age's most indelible architectural images. However, when he is designing the TWA terminal and then Dulles Airport, architecture of aviation was in a pretty sorry state. The earliest airfields in America or in Europe were usually sort of repurposed farm fields. That's why the Wright brothers in Ohio are so successful with their experiments, landing in these sort of empty spaces. Air travel was expensive, it was unsafe, it was dangerous, it was risky, and there just wasn't a lot of passenger service. So by the 1920s, when passenger airlines become start to come into existence, we get our very first airports, like the Ford Airport here in Dearborn, which has what we can consider the sort of first modern passenger terminal, where there is a place to purchase tickets, check in your luggage, and wait for your plane. Designed by Henry Ford's architect, Albert Kahn, it also has one of America's first airport hotels, the Dearborn Inn. And Ford used this as a place to sell and advertise his tri-motor airlines, and it was a way of bringing the masses to air travel. However, this air terminal is essentially a sort of glorified bus station, and other designers were more visionary, like Wilbur Austin's Ideal Airport, where he proposed that you could have on one end airplanes running under the terminal, and people would walk up and then walk across to the buses and cars and then connect to train travel as well. And so you have a vision for what an airport could be, even if on the ground, most airports are more like this. As the 1930s bring about a sort of traveling class, it's still very expensive, you have the creation of airports across the country, small, regional, usually one-room buildings designed by such sort of august firms as Delano and Aldrich, the great New York classicist on the left, or regional firms working in a sort of PWA streamlined art deco style, like the one in Portland. The shape of the building, the form of it, can really take any expression. So in Los Angeles, we have the first building of LAX in a Spanish mission style, in the airfield here being groomed by a flock of sheep. Now, the building structure, the architectural expression, really has no relationship to the actual function of the building. In Kansas City, we get a sort of grand PWA style building established by Charles Lindbergh, and this will become, in Kansas City, Missouri, the home of the Transcontinental and Western Airlines, TWA, who begin here in 1930 from a series of mergers, and TWA starts a route from New York City to Los Angeles through St. Louis, Kansas City, and other stops. Now, these rather conventional sort of bus depot terminals were contrasted by visionary architects like Le Corbusier, who envisioned a contemporary city that would be entirely anchored at its business district by a large airfield on top of a huge parking structure, where the efficiency of high-rise office buildings would whisk you down in an elevator and onto an airfield to travel elsewhere in France. And you can see in Le Corbusier's vision, on the right, he has this circular airfield surrounded by towers in the park, and then on the left, the sort of business district. It was an ideal sort of vision of the future where air travel would be intimately connected to the very city that it served. Closer to home, Lloyd Wright, the son of Frank Lloyd Wright, proposed this circular airfield for Los Angeles, where you had airplanes that would take off in any direction across a circular field and then land at a sort of huge circular terminal built in his father's prairie style. And this circular airfield, which many different architects envisioned, would become a reality in what is considered the sort of first modern airport, Tempelhof Airport. Now, this is commissioned by the fascist government, and there is this association between militarism and aviation, where the technology that allows the jet age, that allows commercial flight after World War II, is coming out of the war. And so while Hitler and his architect Albert Speer envisioned this as a sort of gateway to a horrific vision of Berlin, it does serve as the model for most post-war airports. And Tempelhof uses a system where a large public plaza leads into a series of offices and hotels, and then a huge, well, it was the largest airport in the world, terminal that leads immediately through to the airfield, where airplanes seen here during the Berlin airlift of 1948, US planes are taxiing under the actual terminal, under this huge roof, solving the problem of how you actually get from an airplane into the terminal, which will become Eero Saarinen's great challenge at TWA. Now, Eero Saarinen comments that this is an airport he is looking at for great inspiration. In Denmark, this streamlined, quite striking modern building where the terminal is underneath a reinforced concrete roof. And it provides column-free, wall-free space that allows all the sort of process of the airport to take place in a large central room. In New York, Mayor LaGuardia opens the New York Municipal Airport in 1939 with a rather conventional sort of classical Art Deco building by his favorite architects, Delano and Aldrich. And the sort of classical language of the architecture has a sort of innate contradiction to the modern travel of air behind it. LaGuardia's airport was the sort of vision of the future for New York air travel, but it quite quickly is becoming too small and too limited to future expansion. And so LaGuardia commissions Delano and Aldrich to build a new airport on 6,000 acres of golf and marshland. Now, LaGuardia will be voted out of office in 1945, and the next mayor sort of looks at this classical Beaux-Arts Roman scheme of an airport by Delano and Aldrich and hires modernist Wally Harrison to come in and redesign what will become Idlewild Airport, JFK. Now, Wally Harrison had been associated with Raymond Hood in the design of Rockefeller Center. He had designed worked on Radio City Music Hall and the United Nations building. He's a foremost New York modernist, and he proposes here a terminal where you would drive in the highway underneath the building, be whisked up by escalators into a massive arrivals hall, and then sort of sit and watch the drama of the airplanes along a huge Baroque peripheral building. And you can see this sort of Baroque shape, this amoeba shape. This is all one single building with 86 planes docking alongside it within a radial system of runways that allow airplanes to take off in any wind condition. Construction began on this project without funding for the building, so a temporary terminal was placed in the middle of these radiant runways before Wally Harrison redesigns the project on the suggestion of both New York City and the Port Authority, as well as the airlines. He calls the idea Terminal City, and in 1954, the Port Authority of New York decides that it will build the International Arrivals Building, and then individual airlines will build, like a sort of shopping center suburb of air terminals, individual buildings around a central garden, Liberty Park. Now, the entire thing will be connected by the Van Wyck Expressway, and we see here in 1958 the start of Terminal City. Now, in the center is this sort of Palace of Versailles garden that quite quickly gets paved over for additional parking. But the first buildings that open are the International Arrivals Terminal. Designed by the august modernist SOM, it features a sort of functional glass and steel building in the manner of Eero Saarinen's General Motors Technical Center. And its sort of most distinguishing features are the control tower and this arched arrival hall, which is a very simple sort of steel arch with concrete reinforcing. It is successful without being particularly inspiring. This is what the government has paid for. But when it comes time for the individual airlines to build their building, Wally Harrison envisions that they too will do some sort of streamlined, efficient, modest architecture. But we are in a new age. Mad Men, Madison Avenue has taken over, and these airlines know that whatever they build in New York will become an ambassador of their brand, an extension of their airline's identity. It's part of a larger process in the post-war period that Architectural Forum calls corporate showpiece movement, which started with the Lever House, where the soap company builds a giant glass building that they wash with Lever soap, or where Alcoa Aluminum builds a skyscraper out of aluminum, or Inland Steel sheathes their building in stainless steel. It is an idea that a company's building is a component in their corporate marketing, and that the corporate image is also the building's image. It extended from large buildings, large corporations like these, down to individual sort of companies where McDonald's sort of becomes iconic for its use of this version of mid-century modern architecture to associate the hamburgers with this building. And it is a way of organizing corporate communications, of using architecture to sell your product, like the 76 gas station on the right, where the sweeping curves of the architecture, I mean, how could you not fill up here versus a much more mundane building down the way? Eero Saarinen is probably the most celebrated figure of this corporate architectural turn. And he had already created buildings like the General Motors Technical Center, where the car and the building are a unified expression. Or in Moline, Illinois, where John Deere, a maker of tractors that sit out in the landscape, occupy a headquarters of Corten Steel sitting out in the landscape. Or IBM, where the blue surface pattern is coming from IBM's punch cards that they're using inside, now expressed on the building. So for TWA, how they actually choose Eero Saarinen, it is not the president of the company, it's not Howard Hughes, it is in fact the head of the PR department who suggests Eero Saarinen, because he says that air travel must be marketed like a consumer project, just as if it is a cake of soap. And so he wants an architect who can give him a differentiated signature building. And at the time, 1956, when Aero is commissioned, TWA is most associated with its Lockheed Constellation. This was the airplane that TWA had invested in World War II, and they were the first to take it into service in 1943. It was iconically associated with TWA, and as the jet age arrived, TWA missed the mark. They did not order any Boeing 707 or Douglas DC-8s, and so they were stuck with these older planes, and they were searching for an architecture that could sort of replace in the public's mind the Connie constellations for a new expanded market. TWA in the 50s was pioneering the advertisement of flights for the masses. They invent the tourist class, the coach class in 1949. And in 1952, they start a Go Now, Pay Later program for installments. In their advertisements, you see that they are attempting to become the family airline. And you see those constellations really as marking what the company was all about. Elsewhere in Anaheim, TWA funds part of Tomorrowland, where an in-house designer creates the Moonliner, which would be TWA's future project to get the masses to the moon and back on a TWA airline. And I think there is this sort of synchronicity between what GM was doing as far as demonstrating how a corporation could create a better American future and the architecture that TWA needed. So GM selected Eero Saarinen to form its corporate image, and now TWA selects Eero Saarinen for theirs. When Eero receives the commission, he does what he does best, which is start to research. And he's really limited to one book because there is only one book on airport planning, Walter Prokosch's Airport Planning, which is the sort of guideline for what a jet age airport might be. Saarinen realizes that TWA in their guidelines of what they want in a terminal have copied word for word, plagiarized out of airport planning what Walter Prokosch says should be an airport. So Saarinen realizes that his client doesn't really know what they want, and it's up to him to discover how the architecture will best serve TWA. And so Saarinen, who was always traveling, starts doing research. And as he travels, you can see him here, he's putting a stopwatch into his coat. He is taking detailed notes of the entire process of air travel. As he goes around the country, he is measuring not only on airports, but also in train stations. How long does it take to get places? He hated being delayed in that liminal space between the car and the airplane or the train. And so he would time, how long does it take to land, to taxi, to deplane, to get your bags, to get into the cab? And he uses this analysis in the design of the TWA terminal. They create some 40 pages of documents saying everything that will help in the transformation of airports transitioning from facilities that handle airplanes to facilities that handle people. He realizes in his travels and in his research that airports are terrible and everyone knows it. You have here a cartoon from the architectural record that shows the sort of drama and trauma of moving from the car to the airplane as our little figure moves from the top to the bottom, tumbling and becoming more and more disheveled until from outdoors he climbs into the airplane. One critic said, in the air, consumers may be treated like a king, but on the ground, he has to fight his way through a chamber of horrors. And there is just a great level of disorganization in modern air terminals. And what one designer proposes is that an ideal airport will simply not have walls. It will simply allow you to move in one direction, arriving or departing, and allow the system to work as a system. It's not really an architectural space. It is an architectural form. And we can really, our sort of way of managing people. And we can see how at TWA, as we walked through it, those flowcharts that Eero Saarinen drew in research, the flowchart becomes exactly every stop as you moved through the TWA terminal. When he is given the site, TWA was a little disappointed because they were here in a corner. But what Saarinen liked about this corner was that he had both a more dynamic street frontage, because his building would be entirely along a curve and not a straight part of the road. And also it would be directly on axis with the entrance, which inspires him to come up with a fully symmetrical building. Now, there's only one known sketch of the TWA terminal, but here we can see his idea of a large single roof that houses everything needed for the passenger terminal. He quickly transitions from working in sketches to models, and they create the first design in late 1956 with this monolithic, sort of undulating biomorphic roof that leads out on little piers to satellites that would allow you to board the plane. As they're working on this design, Aline and Eero take a month-long trip through Southeast Asia. And we can see here Aline on one of the propeller planes that they use to travel to Southeast Asia. And in January of 1957, the Saarinens arrive in Sydney. Saarinen was invited to be a judge for the new Opera House competition. He shows up and he says, "I'm late, my plane was delayed in Fiji." And he looks at all of the entries and he says, "Is this everything? These are terrible." And he goes through all of the rejected entries and he pulls out a submission from the Danish architect, Jørn Utzon, and he says, "This is your winning design." But he has to convince the jury and the governor. And they are not compelled by this shape of concrete shells. And so Saarinen, who realizes the sort of iconic value of this design, takes out his own set of pencils and he redraws Utzon's plan to help convey what these large concrete thin shell structures would actually feel like as you looked at them in Sydney Harbor. He convinces the jury to award the commission to Utzon, and Saarinen has really set out to create the iconic image of modern day Sydney. And on the flight back, he's thinking about Utzon's design, these thin concrete shells with their crisp folded edges. He's thinking about Norse helmets, and he sits down, as the story, the legend goes, to breakfast with Aline in their Bloomfield Hills house. And she asks him to describe how the work on TWA is going. He looks at his half a grapefruit for breakfast, and he begins to rip the grapefruit and unfold it into the shape of the roof. He takes that little grapefruit to the office where they turn it into a clay model at 6 inches, then it goes up to 15 inches until they get to these massive models that they start working on. Here you see Eero and Kevin Roach working on the sort of structural systems of how this complicated roof form might actually stand up. César Pelli becomes intimately involved in the project now, and he begins to work again on these full-sized models. They take the design to the executives at TWA, and Eero would later say he never thought the building looked like a bird. That was never what he was going for. He would say, "If the public sees a bird, how wonderful. Architecture should convey meanings, but I was never envisioning a bird. I was envisioning structure." However, in the presentation pamphlet for TWA, you can see that it's not a rendering of the building, but a photograph of birds taken by Balthazar Korab that actually advertised this for TWA. Now, the company is enthusiastic, they approve the design, and Saarinen goes to his trusted engineers at Ammann and Whitney to create the structural system. When Abator walks into the building, he says, I looked at the model with a sense of bewilderment. I didn't actually know how to make sense of what I saw. And Abator, the engineer, says, there are three types of architect in the world. Those like Louis Kahn, who will integrate structure and mechanical systems into the architecture. And the architecture and the structure are one cohesive design. Then there's the rest of the architects who, in the words of Abator, say they come to the structural engineer as if they're at a gas station and say, fill her up with structure. And he said that's what Saarinen was asking him to do. And the third type is an architect who knows what they want, but will work with the engineer to figure it out. And what Saarinen was asking for was a thin shell concrete roof on top of the terminal. What exactly is a thin shell concrete construction? Well, they date all the way back to the 1920s, and they are meant to span large volumes of space with a minimum amount of material and with no columns. Early thin shell constructions like this market hall in Spain are just 3.5 inches of concrete thick, covering 180 feet of empty space. Engineers like Nervi in Italy will transform the thin shell concrete construction into something much more expressive than just a concrete form and bring a certain dynamism to the engineering. Or in Mexico, Felix Candela becomes the sort of America's master of thin shell concrete construction with his churches, factories, and other buildings in these sort of swooping catenary arches. Now, Eero Saarinen will say that, yes, he's aware of these thin shell construction, but he's also looking at designers like the Spanish-American Gustavino, who uses clay tiles coated in concrete to create thin concrete shells. But the building that Saarinen is most thinking of is probably the most famous airport in America at the time, the recently opened St. Louis airport, designed by Minoru Yamasaki. Now, Yamasaki thought of his thin-shelled concrete vaults as parachutes, allowing light in between and covering this large clear span space. Now, what Yama was trying to do, and what Saarinen says he doesn't do, is to create a vault that feels more like it's being held down than being supported. And Eero Saarinen said that this airport was grounded. He wanted vaults more like those by the great English architect Sir John Soane, where you see the vault and it feels almost as if the columns are actually holding it in place instead of supporting it up. And Saarinen says what Yamasaki has done are heavy grounded vaults, or domes. And if he wanted a heavy grounded dome, he said his at GM was better because it had a brick wall. And that seemed to be the logical way for a vault to grow. But Saarinen was already at this point designing and working on another thin shell concrete structure. His first was at MIT, which looks like these other thin shell domes, but has a major structural change that becomes a major structural error. And that is the fact that it is 1/8 of a circle. It is a triangular thin shell concrete dome that is supported by large edge arches. And the problem with this is that Saarinen designs the building and everyone says that is structurally illogical. They call it the vulgar child, and then he renames it the chosen one. And so he completely changes. Everyone in the office says that's never going to stand up. Saarinen says, this is how the auditorium has to be built. And he goes to Ammann and Whitney and he hires them to make it stand up. They tell him, this is not going to work. This is not good design. And the problem is that the dome, if you look at these domes from the early 20th century, a dome wants to have a constant footing. It wants to land in a circle. And what Saarinen does is he has a very conventional dome up to this point, but then the forces of this concrete shell, this membrane, are going to start going all out of whack. And there's no way for the engineers to measure, without computers, which they don't have, measure the forces of what actually is happening here, how the load is transferring down to these arches at all of these different dimensions. And so the dome is not based on any sort of structural logic, and it in fact defies every known principle of membrane thin shell concrete construction. And when they go to build it, it immediately starts to be complicated by the fact that the Saarinen have told their contractor to build it however they feel. They don't control how the concrete is poured. They don't control the method of the formwork's construction. It's poured in the dead of winter over 3 months. They allow the concrete to cure at each level, so there are cold joints of concrete going up. And they also are not able to sort of keep the concrete in this sloping position. And so when Harper's Bazaar comes to run a profile on Eero Saarinen, and they do this sort of heroic great architect, of course, none of his circle, none of his team are in the photo shoot, but he sort of is looking at this brand new concrete thin shell construction resting on these dramatic 3 arches. And what he doesn't tell Harper's Bazaar is that at the time of this photograph, he knows that the structure has failed. They start taking the shoring out of the building and it starts sagging beyond an allowable limit. And so what they have to do is put in steel reinforcing under these arches. They did not get it to work where it actually supported itself. And so the principles of a thin shell concrete vault are no longer actually functioning here at the MIT chapel. Now, Charles Whitney of Ammann and Whitney spoke at MIT in 1954 on the Conference of Thin Shells, and he said at the time, he just doesn't mention the project. And then he says that building has no general rule as to their justification. And I think Saarinen learns his lesson. He says the dome is too earthbound. He admits the structure didn't work. And so when Abator is looking at this building and saying, this is never going to work as a structural system, Saarinen gets angry. And then he says, well, what do we do? And Abator begins to sort of bring himself into a full part of the design team. And the great change that occurs as they build these models is they split a monolithic roof into 4 individual sections. Those 4 sections then act as individual thin shell construction that are supported on their own columns. And so instead of having one large sheet of concrete that is going to have immeasurable forces, they have sort of arches that are both arches and domes that they're able to actually run calculations on. The problem becomes how these suspended vaults or concrete shapes actually meet the ground. Saarinen called this the cockroach airport because of its 8 little legs. And they eventually settle on a series of just 4 points of contact where Y-shaped concrete buttresses will grow out of the earth and then support this entire concrete structure. And this is the sort of great gesture of TWA that makes the building both bird-like, but also seem like it is soaring out of the sort of asphalt. Now, the models are photographed and they are published, and the building becomes a celebrity in and of itself well before they have figured out, can they build it? And if so, how will they build it? They take their models and the model photographs and they slice them up, as Abator says, like salami. And they take these sort of slices and they do all their engineering calculations on a slice, and then they combine all the slices, and if everything equals 0, they think that should stand up. Now, they continue to refine the design of the building with these models. And as they do, Claude DeForest is here to come up with a whimsical little cartoon showing a traveler moving through the airport who, hitting these concrete curves, has become decapitated on his journey to the airplane. Now, the models themselves become how the structural engineers are able to create the design drawings. The Saarinen firm was working at full scale. They would work in the model. Here you see Saarinen's legs popping out of the model. And as they would tape these sheets of paper, they would then be photographed here by Balthazar Korab and sent to the engineers who would turn them into construction documents. Now, as a contractor looking at this drawing, I would have no idea what to do next. And so the contractors Grove, Shepard, Wilson, and Krug have to approve the entire construction system before they're able to break ground. And they end up producing about twice as many documents on how to build the building as Eero Saarinen and Associates produced telling them what the building should be. So they end up creating 9 months of manuals of how to actually create this structure. Ground is broken in June of 1959. There's Eero, second from the right. And if you think about every concrete building you've ever seen, at some point there was an inverse of that building. Concrete is poured, if it is poured in place, must have some type of wooden or steel holder. And so the first task of actually building TWA, after they have driven all the pilings, remember it's a marsh, so they're putting pilings into the earth. They're doing them at an angle because the forces from the roof will be coming down at an angle. And then they start building wooden formwork. And they use carpenters to create the entire air terminal in wood in the sort of opposite, the mirror image. Now, there were no computers used in the calculations of the actual concrete structure, but there was a very early computer used to create the scaffolding. There were some 5,000 pieces of steel that supported this enormous wooden structure that would become hugely heavy with wet concrete. And so the cost of the roof was about $15 a square feet, and more than half of that was from the formwork. They couldn't reuse the form because the whole thing had to be built at the exact same time, or it would fall over because the four quadrants are connected and resting on each other. If they were to build one piece of the quadrant on that Y-shaped buttress and then try and reuse the formwork next to it, it would completely collapse without its counterweight of the other concrete part. Now, the actual journey of building these 5,000 tubular steel frames, holding some 2,500 wedges on 27 different shapes, and then countless individual wooden pieces, it was a multi-month process. It took most of the first year of construction to build the concrete formwork. It was then coated in shellac and then marked with spray paint, telling you exactly what type of concrete mixture and how thick it should be at any one instance. Concrete is incredibly strong compressive, but it has no tensile strength. You can't pull concrete. And so you add steel rebar inside of concrete in order to give it additional strength. Here you can see the steel rebar, which was its own engineering problem, laid out on top of the concrete formwork. Now, John Dinkeloo was on site in New York. When he told Tor, he said, "Abba, if you don't pour the joint straight in the way Aero wants it, he'll have your head on a platter." And Tor told John Dinkeloo, "My head will do him no good on the platter. My head has to stay on my shoulders, not on his platter." And he later would confide to an interviewer that as the structural engineer, he thought this should work. Everything said it should work, but he didn't know exactly if it was going to work. And so when they start the concrete pour, it is a 120-hour straight process because they cannot let the concrete dry from the start to the finish. It takes 30 hours from pouring the buttress to pouring the top of the roof. They used a coordinated system where all of the workers in red and white shirts had numbers that told exactly what their role was. And so there were people with notebooks who were looking out and saying, number 4 should be right there at this exact moment. Everything is going smoothly. The spray paint on top of the wooden formwork was complemented by spray paint on the buckets that told you exactly which bucket of concrete was meant to go where. Inside, underneath the formwork, was a team of engineers who were looking at plumb levels, so weights on a string, and watching how much those weights were shifting as the concrete is poured on top of the wood. And they would radio up and they would tell the engineers on above, sort of, it's too heavy on this point, we need weight on this point. And because everything was so coordinated, they could tell them exactly where the next bucket needed to go as the inside formwork is shifting under the weight of wet concrete. They worked straight through the night under Klieg lights until they had poured all 4 sections. They finish it in September, and it takes until November for the formwork to cure. At the center is a 44-inch thick pentagon of solid concrete that joins together the 4 wings of the building. When they get ready to take the formwork down, it is a process in and of itself because they have to measure how much the concrete is shifting and settling. Cracks had already begun to appear in the Pan Am terminal, and so JFK, the Port Authority, was very concerned with how this concrete monument, that no one quite knew if it was going to stand up, how it would work. They take the formwork down and you are left with this pretty incredible sculpture of concrete. It does stand up, and in the end, after 90 days, it has only deflected about 1/4 of an inch in places, 2 inches in others. As you get closer, you see the actual method of construction. You see the wooden formwork leading up to these wide buttresses. And it's really just a pretty incredible sculptural form. And Eero Saarinen stood in this building in April of 1961, and he said, if they stopped right now, we would have a beautiful ruin like the boughs of Karkala. And he looks at Abator, his structural engineer, and he says, if this were to fall on my head now, I would die a happy man. Of course, it doesn't fall, it does stand up, and he is able to then continue the process of sealing the concrete roof with 1,500 gallons of silicone, and then outfitting the building with windows, asbestos spray on the inside for acoustics and fireproofing, and turning this large, not exactly thin shell, some places it's 44 inches thick, but this shell concrete construction into a building. There was one other issue that was left to resolve, which was actually how you got the passengers onto the plane. And so Kevin Roach and Eero Saarinen head out to O'Hare, where they see some of the first gangways, and they help to convince TWA to use these new modern ways of going into jets. And Saarinen looks at this thing and he says, boy, if something goes wrong with it, we will have unhappy passengers. Of course, today this seems like such a standard practice, but it was a pretty bold use of a new technology to actually connect the terminal to the planes. And so in the end, you have this efficient sort of terminal where, starting from the car, you swoop in through the doors, through the lobby, and then out to the plane. And a year before they had finished the project, the PR and marketing team was going into a multi-million-dollar campaign advertising the new terminal. The TWA ad manager said, we advertised it as though it were a national monument. Before the building is completed, Eero Saarinen dies in September of 1961. And so in March and May of 1962, as parts of the building go into operation, Eero will never see his finished terminal. The interior is outfitted by the Saarinen office. They designed the Ambassador Club, which you can see had proposed womb chairs here, are here with the fountain that we saw earlier, while the rest of the interiors are designed by Raymond Loewy. And Loewy had been commissioned to redesign not only the logo of TWA, but also the uniforms and all of the sort of supporting infrastructure of the airline. And it's Loewy who gives the TWA its iconic red letters. And he also designs the cafes within the building. Now, once the structure is actually dedicated, it is a huge popular success. TWA throws a multi-month-long dedication series of events, and NBC carries the entire event live on May 28, 1962, to a soundtrack of sort of Hollywood thriller music. They dedicate the new TWA Flight Center. And Aline Saarinen dedicates a small plaque in the center of the terminal dedicated to her husband. It becomes, as the PR team says, the winged gateway to the world of flight, a passenger's dream. Everything here adds pleasure to your journey. In the architectural press, though, critics were a little bit more harsh. Peter Blake in the Architectural Record compares TWA to an enlarged Danish salad bowl. Meanwhile, Ada Louise Huxtable says that the modern traveler, freshly fed from frozen food, enters the city not in splendor, but through the bowels of streamlined concrete birds. It was not exactly the most popular thing among architecture critics, and yet the people loved it, and it becomes almost as iconic as Disneyland in the popular imagination, representing what flight and air travel might be. Now, at the same time that Ammann and Whitney are engineering the TWA Flight Center, they are commissioned by the federal government to design a new jet airport for Washington. And the engineers must not have been too scarred by Eero Saarinen's work at Kresge or at MIT or at TWA, because they are assigned the role of hiring a design architect for the airport, and they hire Eero Saarinen. And Dulles Airport becomes the great apotheosis of Eero Saarinen and Associates and Ammann and Whitney, of architect and engineer, where instead of being designed by Eero Saarinen as a sort of architectural model, as a form, and then engineered to stand up, the engineering and the architecture are designed at the exact same time. Now, we don't have time to talk about all of the sort of modern ways that Dulles introduces sort of jet age travel, but needless to say, we see things like separated departures and arrivals, a fully automated bag handling system, and really things that are quite common to us as air travelers today. And all of it is underneath this great hanging inverted TIMP, which was built as a sort of systemized approach. Instead of having all custom woodwork, the process of building these canted steel reinforced and limestone concrete columns was to first build the steel reinforcing rods, then move into place on railroad tracks these large formworks that could be moved from column to column, pouring the concrete of the base column, and then moving this scaffolding piece where you could pour the great beam that runs across these columns. The columns are 40 feet apart in the short direction, and 120 feet back, you have a shorter column, which was then connected by a 1-inch thick cable. And remember, Ammann and Whitney are bridge engineers first and foremost, but this is not quite a suspension bridge. It is, in fact, another version of a thin shell concrete construction. This time, the shell is simply hanging upside down. The cables were stretched across, covered by precast concrete panels, and then poured with a thin layer of a concrete shell and covered by a membrane. It is really a very simple and sort of intuitive, almost tent-like structure. At the same time, it was a great engineering challenge, and Ammann and Whitney and the team really view this as the best relationship they have between an architect and an engineer. Now, the building sort of as Saarinen's goal reflects the sort of federal architecture of Greater Washington. It doesn't have that sort of Jetsons appearance of the TWA Flight Center. It doesn't have what could be considered the sort of crass commercialism of TWA asking for a building that will be marketable. Instead, here at Dulles, Eero Saarinen and Associates came up with both a structural system that was more elegant and more sort of refined and integral to the end product, but he also created an architecture that was appropriate for federal Washington. The landscape designed by Dan Kiley situated this great terminal out into this sort of gateway of the American continent. And it's Scully who says that Saarinen's greatest gift in these air terminals was knowing the sort of space of the American scene and then figuring out how to get us into it, to build airport terminals that are not just scaled to our body and to the sort of process of boarding an airplane, but that sort of reach out to something larger. Now, before we conclude, I want to just think about where these airports sort of took us. If the jet age was here by 1958 and traveling is sort of fashionable throughout the 1960s as you have different designers getting in on designing airports and airplanes and uniforms, Saarinen would design one other airport in Athens. He designs an airport that actually has outdoor boarding and then a sort of great temple-like form where you have this almost sort of Paul Rudolph interior of a great interior volume. This airport closed in 2001. It was never really quite as celebrated or as original as the airports in America. At Dulles, or at JFK, Idlewild Airport, Architectural Forum said, in the great competition of terminals, it's quite clear who won. And there was really no other airline who could compete with TWA, even though architects like Walter Prokosch, who designed the sort of airline standards with his great Worldport, which have this concrete overhang inspired by Tempelhof Airport that would protect car passengers on one side and protect airplanes on the other. It also had curtains of warm air that were shining up through the street to enclose the car passengers as they disembarked. It becomes obsolete almost immediately because jets can't fit under it. Or at the American Airlines terminal, where the world's largest work of stained glass ran across an otherwise quite banal building. These are structures that were already being designed when Eero Saarinen was working on his airports. But as soon as Aline Saarinen starts the PR machine, airports start looking more like Eero Saarinen. Most explicitly in Las Vegas, Welton Beckett, the LA architect, builds a sort of a simpler version of TWA, where he uses cut concrete shells as a sort of intersection. But notice that his system is really disconnected from the larger logic of the airport. As a very conventional terminal hall here, very conventional sort of satellite fingers. And this is just sort of one visual moment that's filled with a 40-foot long mural on the allegories of gambling. And it's actually simply a casino within the airport. Or at Atlanta Airport, you have, again, a concrete shell structural system at the departure and arrivals gate. And then one of the entrance halls is another thin shell concrete work that I don't think would have existed without Eero Saarinen. His sort of classicism, modern classicism at Dulles will influence other architects who build, again, concrete structures resting on columns. But I think the only airport that comes close to TWA in its sense of whimsy is LAX, where outside of the airport, they build the part spaceship, part flying saucer, very unusual looking and totally functionalist to the actual purpose of the airport, this sort of Jetsons theme building, which was meant to serve as both a restaurant, observation deck, but mostly as an icon. And you see here the complete removal of architecture as a sort of functional art. The airport, LAX itself, is actually still using that Spanish Revival building as part of its terminal, but they're also just using these sort of large glass sheds. There is no reason for this to exist other from a sort of marketing standpoint. Now, you could make a whole thesis of why that's in LA and the other is in New York, but it is from a very sort of high style architectural team. William Pieria, who did the Transamerica building, Paul R. Williams, the first Black architect to win the AIA gold medal. These are heavy hitting architects who are building essentially a folly at the airport. And you have a remove from architectural experimentation in the terminal to the parking lot. And the excitement that TWA and Dulles brought sort of peter out as the innovations of the modern jet age have all been established. Eero Saarinen wanted to put moving sidewalks in the tunnels of the TWA terminal, but the TWA executives thought that people would be too intimidated because conveyor belts were used for factories and not for people. When LAX does install the world's first moving sidewalks, they take that fear of factories and they get the greatest sort of dame of factory conveyor belts, Lucille Ball, to dedicate the moving sidewalk. As she walked down the sidewalk talking to reporters who were running beside her on the not moving sidewalk, she celebrated this great innovation. And I think this is the sort of last great innovation in airport architecture. The Googie style will continue on in Southern California, but it won't continue on in architecture of airports. And by 1970, and particularly with the deregulation of the airline industry by Jimmy Carter, you have airport architecture going into, if not a dystopian wing, what Alistair Gordon, the great airport historian, calls the sterile concourse period. And on the left, you have Cranbrook alum Goya Obata, who studied with Ailill Saarinen, but seems not to have applied many Cranbrook lessons here, designing the Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, the world's largest at the time. The entirety of the island of Manhattan can fit within its 17,000 acres. And it is a series of mile-long or mile-radius circles where you park in the center and you go to a terminal. When they go to dedicate the airport in 1973, the mayor of Dallas says, well, where do we dedicate it? And the airport says, well, there actually is sort of no center here. There is no room. There is no terminal. There is no moment like the flight center where our spirits will be lifted. This is just architecture as function, and they end up not even dedicating it here. They find a place in Dallas to dedicate the new terminal, or in Atlanta, where the Hartsfield International Airport, designed by Stevens Wilkins, Smith, Hinchman, and Grills, and minority airport architects, introduces the concept of underground trains that take you to midfield terminals. And as someone who grew up flying in and out of here, there are few redeeming qualities to this type of sort of factory concourse. And so I think of the sort of optimism which Eero Saarinen's architecture embodied. And in the months before he died, he visited Dulles Airport. And when he saw the cables being suspended, he saw the columns, he saw it on its sort of temple-like pedestal out in the landscape of rural Virginia, he said, "I think this terminal building is the best thing I have done. Maybe it will explain what I believe about architecture." The airports were critically important to both Eero Saarinen professionally and to his legacy and his reputation. When TWA closed the terminal in 2001, the Port Authority slated it for demolition, as it has now done with every original building from Terminal City. The architectural community springs into action to save the terminal building, but interestingly, so does the public. And you have an architectural preservation campaign that is uniquely supported by members of a non-architectural set. In 2008, Gensler Architects built T5, the JetBlue terminal, and they encircle Eero Saarinen's as a sort of art object within the modern air terminal. And just a couple of years ago, the airport opens as a hotel. And you're seeing on the right, the airport wing, on the left, a Lockheed Constellation that's now a hotel bar. And in the center, you see the terminal restored to its sort of 1962 purity, but now as a sort of event space and hotel lobby. As the architectural trends that Eero Saarinen started, of turning buildings into a way of conveying corporate values, of making buildings events in and of themselves, of making architecture something that could communicate not just ideas about structure, but of ideas about value, of brands, of optimism, of what a culture sees. There's a great democracy to this language. Eero Saarinen also kicked off the idea of the architect as celebrity and the building as a destination. I think that TWA Flight Center's current position as this sort of architectural tchotchke within the horrors of modern JFK reflect the logical extension of what Eero Saarinen started, where now the building that was in 1962 the epitome of an architectural destination is now a monument to itself and the epitome of a sort of architecture as tourist attraction. That doesn't make the building any less great, and I think it's a testament to the enduring power of what Saarinen, Ammann, and Whitney and his circle created. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. If you have questions, I'm happy to take them. I will say that within the architectural literature, Dulles Airport is the much more celebrated of the two. I'm sort of less interested in it because it, as a sort of spiritual experience, which is what I most appreciate about architecture, it is a little bit more kind of one note. But there are so many people who have written about the TWA terminal. And when I send you your reading list at the end of the course, I'll make sure to annotate it at what I sort of found most interesting of how TWA really took a work of architecture that was incredibly sort of highbrow. Eero Saarinen was the sort of ultimate kind of not academic architect, but just serious architect, and turned it into this popular thing that seemed to have no limits of what they could do as far as exploiting it for the image of TWA. If you have a question, do feel free to go ahead and unmute.
Hey, Kevin, I had a question for you.
Yes, Joe.
Yes, Joe.
Hi, so you mentioned Googie architecture as like a style that evolved out of some of this swooping. Could you explain a little bit more about that and kind of how that stemmed from the TWA and what Aero Saarinen was doing?
Sure. They're really happening concurrently. So the Jetsons, the cartoon, starts shortly after TWA opens. The New York Jets rename the year the TWA opens. There is this idea of the jet age as a new sort of cultural era. And Googie architecture, which is mostly a Southern California thing, though as McDonald's shows, it exists everywhere. But it was this idea that essentially architecture, I think there is an implicit critique in it that architecture is somehow boring. And so it becomes this very populist form of using dramatic structure for a very sort of populist, satisfying manner. So like the LAX building, there's not usually a reason to have these swooping curves or great vaults, or think of, the Stardust, the Las Vegas sign as Googie. It's just sort of fun. It exploits sort of modern materials like plastic and steel. It certainly exploits the language of modernism in the 1920s and 30s, but for usually non-structural purposes, usually for advertising purposes. And I think that Saarinen, he was sort of delighted that his architecture, that TWA, becomes a popular hit. He's sort of delighted that the people love it. And as the critics continue to dismiss it, one critic says, we have TWA on the East Coast and California has Cinderella's Castle. And he basically makes no distinction between these two buildings that open at the same time. Saarinen looks at it and says, okay, well, what's Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim, which you have to remember is also the exact same moment. And you have, I think, in both architecture and popular culture, a search for some sort of satisfaction, for some sort of popular appeal, that I think the more formal language of Mies van der Rohe and like the GM Tech Center aren't quite as accessible. And so the great sort of coffee shops, bowling alleys, gas stations, restaurants of LA are what is known as Googie. And it really is this sort of populist reappropriation of very serious architectural language. Good question. It's me, and actually Kevin Roach tried to sort out which the grapefruit story was, and basically both MIT and TWA wanted the grapefruit story to be true, and they wanted it to be their building. So they both are at the exact same time publishing that their buildings are come up from the breakfast table from a grapefruit. I think Aline Saarinen and Aero Saarinen want, any press is good press. So who knows if there was ever a grapefruit.
Okay.
Bob Siegelman for his comments on the Athens airport. I've been through there many times and never did it strike me as anything worthy of a Saarinen project. I'm really sorry. Going back to the TWA terminal, I want to thank you so much for all the extra little tidbits that you have supplied, a little bit of new things that I've learned, and it just makes my heart soar to see that building. It's on my bucket list to go there and stay in the hotel. Thank you so much.
Of course, thank you for coming. And I haven't been. I went when it was still abandoned, and the most shocking thing are those tiles, because you really read the building as a monolithic surface in photographs, but in person, those tiles are omnipresent, and they really act as what Eliel Saarinen always said, you design from the smallest scale to the largest. The tiles act as a very interesting smallest unit because you touch them. You touch them up the stairs, you touch them on the walls, you touch them going in and out of the bathroom. And so there is this real sort of tactile nature that not only spatially can you not really grasp what the air terminal is like, but tactilely, you have to be there in person to really understand it. So my sister Haley and I had a wonderful little trip out there in 2015. Linda, question?
Could you just give the email address again to get a link to watch it again?
Sure, you can just reply to the email that you signed in tonight, but it's center@cranbrook.edu.
Okay.
Center.cranbrook.edu.
And then one other thing, when I was going through, when we were moving out of 20 Davis Street in the old financial closet.
And Debbie, I see a question.
Yeah, the top.
I do think Saarinen was braver than most. I think it was very expensive. It was expensive for TWA, and there were multiple times throughout the project when Aline Saarinen was really advocating for the building to go through, because it was so late. I mean, you essentially have TWA operating out of a wooden and glass structure for 2 years after Northeastern, after Pan Am. They've all moved into their shiny new houses, and Aero is still trying to figure out how to build his. So it's hard to reproduce. It also is that challenge of, last week, Alexander Gerard wrote a lot about how to use color in decorating, and he wrote a lot of sort of treaties. And there's something when you are a genius, as I think both men were, where you can tell someone what to do, you can show them, you can say, these are the principles of architecture, this is the principle of design, but that's that last sort of 5% that is just, where did it come from? How did they figure it out? I think Eero Saarinen and Associates do it by iterative processes and by losing money on all of their projects, spending that time to invest it. But there is just that moment of, Smith, Hinchman, and Grills could have pulled off the tech center, but would they put those stairways in it? There is this moment where you take it from a simple design and bring it into a work of architecture as a work of art. And I think that is what is so hard to do. And it's why, if you're going to go through the sort of children of TWA, you end up in the land of sort of stage sets, of commercial architecture, of theme park design, because there is almost a fantasy that this isn't real life. And Aero showed that it was. He showed that this optimism could continue. But I don't wonder, he died when he was 51, which is tragic. It makes him into this sort of hero figure that Aline is quite conscious of, that he's now a sort of hero figure and will always be a hero figure. But he also dies before the sort of jadedness of the sort of Vietnam era comes in. So he's quintessentially the sort of American century architect, if we think of Henry Luce's The American Century. And so there is an optimism to his buildings. There's this forward-thinking notion that architecture can solve our social ills. Architecture can do anything, that we are clever enough, that engineering is strong enough, technology is moving fast enough, that we can make the best buildings ever. And I think that really quite quickly after his death in 1961, that spirit, that sort of optimism disappears from the architectural community, and you don't have people really trying to make these buildings until you get Frank Gehry, who is the logical sort of inheritor of Saarinen's design language here. And of course, Frank Gehry loves this building, and in reading lots of interviews with Kevin Roach in preparing for this lecture, Roach constantly references Frank Gehry as like basically saying, I would never do this, but Frank Gehry would do it this way. And he's really saying it as this sort of like, maybe Frank Gehry is the unhinged id of Eero Saarinen, that his sort of shapely steel buildings that become celebrity events in of themselves are sort of the end product of what Eero Saarinen was doing. But Eero Saarinen was very serious. He was quiet, he was methodical, and he presented this all as very serious architecture. So I think the fun nature of the building and the sort of children of the building being in a more whimsical category, though still very serious architecture, sort of don't always match up with how I sort of envision Eero Saarinen as a quite serious architect. And with that,
thank you.
Thank you. Yes, with that, we have gone well past the time that Greg took in that introduction, and we should conclude our lovely Monday evening. Just kidding about the intro. We are happy to be here again, and one more week where we will talk about the CBS building, Eero Saarinen's only skyscraper, and a building that was really brought to fruition by Eero Saarinen and Associates without Eero Saarinen. And so I look forward next week to concluding our lecture series and thinking about how one firm located right here in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, transformed the course of American architecture history. Thank you, everyone. Until next Monday.